Well, Professor Peter Timmerman, I'd like to thank you very much for agreeing to being interviewed on the topic of disasters.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Um, so maybe we could start off and you could take a minute telling us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, hi, I'm an associate professor at the new Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York. I have been doing this since 1979. And when I first got started, I was mostly interested in hazards and risk assessment and got involved in nuclear emergency planning and a lot of disaster research. And then over time, I moved away into areas more in association with what my own academic background was, which is basically in philosophy. And I moved into areas looking at religious traditions and the environment, looking at various ethical issues involving the managing of the planet. I put that in quotation marks. And more recently, I've been working in the areas of ecological economics and other related areas. I think that's a rough overview anyway.
So disaster managers and emergency managers will often take a very human-centered approach to this field.
Right.
With the environmental background that you have, looking at it as an environmentalist, how do you think your perspective would be different?
Well, if I can just tweak that a bit, I got involved in looking at environment and looking at disasters from the point of view of somebody whose part of his background was in linguistics, and I was very interested in the language that was being used by emergency and disaster managers. This is sometimes now called plastic words, but there are words that are hybrids, words like risk, hazard, and so on, that have there's a technical meaning, but there's also a kind of human meaning, and that's how I got interested in this area, both in terms of nuclear issues and hazard issues and so on. As I said, I came out of a language background, so I've always been fascinated with the language aspect of it. And as I drifted into being an environmentalist, I became more and more concerned with the larger environmental issues of which disasters are a part. And I guess out of that, I came into the larger idea that the ways in which we manage our society actually foment disasters, and that most of the ways in which we think about disasters are saturated in a set of misguided ideas about what solutions would look like and what the longer term consequences of our management would be. So in that sense, I think I still maintain a human-centered approach. It's just an approach that considers that a lot of what human beings do is wrong or is misguided or latches onto very short-term ways of thinking about problems, whereas our future on this planet depends on real long-term thinking.
So if you look back over your career and how you've thought about disasters, say a few decades ago, as compared to today, how has your thinking changed?
Well, as I said, I started off in this very interesting, strange way of thinking about how people have thought about disasters historically and had sort of interesting concepts of disasters. Before I really got into disaster management, I was first interested in climate change. This is back in the late 1970s when nobody was really interested in climate change. And in various aspects of risk assessment and hazards management. So I was interested in that for a long period of time. And then I began to think about it in more systemic terms, that the way in which we were deploying language, the way in which we were deploying our management strategies was itself the problem, as opposed to just the deploying of certain linguistic terms. The linguistic terms were kind of a key to open up ways of thinking that are problematic to me, if that makes any sense.
Can you give one or two examples specifically of linguistic terms that you think are significant?
A perfectly good one is emergency. I worked in emergency responses for a while. And emergency is a very strange word. It comes out of emergence originally, but it has almost immediately nowadays anyway, it has political implications. That is, if you declare something an emergency, the frame in which everything operates changes, the people who are involved change, the ways in which priorities change. And that is different than how you might think about it if you just said, well, we have a serious problem here. That is, it's sort of like if you hear an ambulance going by, the cars are supposed to stop on the side of the road. If you just see an ambulance going by without the siren going, you go, oh, well, I wonder where they're going for lunch, right? It's a different way of thinking about the world. The same thing is true in part for disaster management. That is, once something is labeled an emergency or a disaster, the way in which you think about it shifts into a disaster frame or an emergency frame, trying to work out how you are to respond. And we have triggers, we have political triggers and legal triggers when things are declared emergencies. In a number of the ones that I've been involved in, the declaration of emergency suddenly involves the military or involves very large scale financial transfers and so on. But until that happens, people just go about doing what they're doing, and then suddenly it turns into something different, and other levels of government and other people begin to get involved because it's a trigger word. We have a lot of trigger words like that. If you do a lot of work in risk assessment, you discover that people have using the term risk does all kinds of interesting things to people's minds.
So this brings up, I think, two interesting questions or issues.
Right.
We've done some work together on disaster narratives, and there's strong links between linguistics, the words we use, and the narrative structures that we use to frame them.
Right.
But also, I know you were quite involved in the Mississauga train derailment disaster.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you can relate what you were saying just now, both to narratives and apply it specifically to that train disaster.
Okay. Just a little background. The disaster happened at the end of 1979. It happened in an area of Mississauga that was not quite fully developed. Nowadays, if the train derailment had happened, it would have dumped into condos and stuff. It was a train that had 100 and some cars. It had some chlorine cars in it, and they mixed those cars together with other cars and so on. And then when the train derailed, it derailed in the last open space before downtown Toronto. And so there were like 9 of these chlorine cars, and there was within about a few minutes, there was a massive response by the fire and police and so on. And then as the night, this happened near midnight, as the night progressed, new levels of government, new ways of thinking about the disaster arrived, so that when, let us say, at 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the morning, major decisions had to be made. They weren't made by higher levels of government. They were made by the police chief and the fire chief, who happened to be people on the scene. And so people who work in disaster management find themselves having to deal with the on-site people very often, who are the first responders, and how they actually deal with these issues. So in that particular case, at let's say 5 o'clock in the morning, they had actually successfully evacuated, or they were in the process of successfully evacuating an area reasonably near where the train derailment was, but they were going to have to start, because of the possibility of leaking chlorine, they were going to have to decide whether to evacuate some old people's homes that were reasonably nearby. And so they had to make an ethical decision, which was possibly they might lose more lives for evacuating the old folks' home than actually had been lost in the derailment, because nobody had actually been injured. Well, actually, there was a reporter who broke a leg heading towards the train derailment. And they had to decide about that. And it wasn't decided at any great high level of government. It was, I think there might have been a phone call to the Attorney General at that point, who was basically coming towards the site. But so they did that. And then had they made their decisions based on that the circumstances that they were in. And because it was an emergency and they were on the ones online, they just threw everything they had at it. They didn't think about budgets. They didn't think about, a lot of them, the fire people particularly, didn't think about their own welfare. They just kind of threw themselves at what was a major disaster. So then that happened. And then over the disaster went on for 4 or 5 days, because they were leaking chlorine cars and no one was absolutely sure what was going on. Over the next 3 or 4 days, new levels of government arrived. And on the second day, they basically commandeered a building near the site And my lighthearted response has always been, if the derailment had lasted a month, they would have built an office building there. They had the Attorney General arrived, secretaries arrived, they began taking minutes, there's transcripts begin to arrive, and so on, and decisions began to be made at what one would call a bureaucratic level. That is, people started to become not just concerned about what they were doing as in the response, but whether they were going to be held responsible and what kind of decisions were going to be, especially once there were transcripts and things. Suddenly it all became much tighter, and it became much more organized it wasn't more organized, it was organized in a more bureaucratic way, which meant that there were judgment calls and so on, which were beginning to be influenced by the actual what I call bureaucratic actions of people. I don't mean bureaucratic in a bad way, although it can be used in a bad way, but just people began to have to remember that they had made a different decision earlier, or they had tried to think about a decision a little bit differently, and to keep a record of it and so on. So all of that was happening. And in the first 3 or 4 hours of the emergency, nobody cared about that. They were just busy trying to save lives. But as the days went by, people started doing risk assessments. They started working out, well, we have now 200,000 people who are out of this city. How many more people, how long this is going to continue? The Highway 401 is nearby. How long can we keep that closed? And so on. So, major ethical decisions began to be involved with the kind of standard decisions people make when they're making judgments about other things, like, do we build a road here or something like that? It became less of a intense emergency and more of a, how do we solve this? Except obviously the whole time they were worried about leaking chlorine and the rest of it. But it became, as I said, it became more bureaucratized. And this is true about disasters generally. I think after a while, the governing people come in and they try and regularize and organize things to fit it back into normalcy. Normalcy is the absolute central theme of most disaster management, which is to get it either back where it was, or to tame this dragon in some way that everybody will go, oh, that's what we're dealing with. But very often at the beginning of an emergency, people are just running around trying to get stuff done, which is not bad. It's good. Obviously, the thing for emergency managers and disaster managers is there a way of streamlining or making that initial process more efficient? Because that's probably, in many cases, where the big problems will lie, because within the first few hours, you can really save people and you can set down tracks that will keep the emergency or the disaster in its own frame for the rest of the time of its existence.
Historically, disasters have been viewed in different ways, especially in ancient societies. Modern perspectives in the Western world are quite different in terms of, say, the role of the divine
Right.
as compared to man. And you bring up the word dragon, which makes me think of Eastern perspectives on disasters as well. And these things can be important, especially in terms of assigning blame and culpability, for example. So in terms, and I know it's complex and it's not homogeneous, but in terms of how perspectives of why disasters happen, how that's evolved over time, what sort of comments would you make about that?
Well, maybe just continuing on from what I was saying, I think one of the things, and following on from what you're saying, is that even in the modern world, underneath a lot of disaster management are very old things that are going on. And one of the things that's going on is who to blame. That is, it now becomes a legal thing, but who caused this? What's the punishment? Is there a punishment? And so on. So you're trying to find out who out there is responsible, or how did this happen, and so on. So all of that's still happening, and now it just happens usually in a more legalistic or, again, bureaucratic format. So if you try to look at the basic traditions behind this, in the Western tradition, our tradition has been very consistently judicial. It's been organized around using let's call it debate and conflict as a way of resolving what actually happened, to try and find truth that way. And usually in the Western tradition, we've, up until very recently anyway, there was this idea of what some people call the natural law tradition, which was a kind of like a moral law, as if it was like gravity, that there were basic rules that people transgressed or didn't transgress. And if they transgressed them, then something was wrong. And a lot of ancient and medieval and probably even modern disasters are people have done something wrong, and the disaster is a punishment. Disaster is either assigning blame or locating blame or clarifying who's to blame or some equivalent. And you can watch that happening even in the most modern disasters, searching around to see who's responsible. And in many cases, finding scapegoats and all of that stuff. These are very traditional ways of looking at it. If you move away from a judicial model, which is one I'm talking about that we use in the Western tradition, if you move to a tradition that is less judicial based, and you actually look for traditions that have a different kind of natural law model. That is, again, I mentioned the natural law as a idea in the Western tradition. It's been certainly central to the churches, particularly the Catholic Church, about the moral basis of trying to understand activity. But in Eastern traditions, the way in which people think about how the universe functions is more of what I would call guidelines, or like the rules of a game, like the rules of playing chess, or more appropriately for many people who know anything about Eastern thought or practice, if you are involved in a martial arts are ones, or like ballet or football, where you train and train and train in a particular set of exercises. And then after a while, the exercises, as it were, kind of take you over. And when you do it really, really well, it's as if it's being done by, like the ballet takes you over, or whatever it might be. And that's because you, as it were, lose your ego, your sense of self, and you actually go with the flow of the universe. You get out of your own way, and you learn over time through all these practices how to become, as it were, translucent anyway to the way in which the universe flows. So it's a kind of it's a game play, but all serious play model, and a kind of model of trying to work out, as it were, internally to the system that you belong to, what the rules are. And there are Eastern traditions where trying to work out, let's go back to this question about punishment and blame. In other cultures, they have what's called karma, and karma is a way of, rather than having an external God who punishes you, which is very strongly available in the in the Western tradition. We talk about acts of God and all that stuff in disaster management. In the Eastern traditions, one of the ideas is that people, as it were, generate their own problems, and the punishments come from people, as it were, having what I would call pollution, or they consistently do the wrong thing because they're, as it were, on a track, on a rail that's been put down by their own previous actions. And in many Eastern traditions, it's a kind of a self-analysis that goes on, and you can do a self-analysis of a whole society. Is what is it that is causing this society to be ignorant, or to make mistakes that seem to be mistakes that are comments on how the whole society has been living for many, many years, thousands of years, or hundreds of years, and so on. It's a kind of an internal dynamic, which is different than saying, I'm going to ask God how and why these people should be punished. And this tends to be how a lot of Eastern traditions work. And one of the reasons why I'm interested in it is because when you're in emergencies and disasters, the personal experience, what some people call the phenomenology of the experience, is, I think, really underconnected to the way in which it is formally studied, the way in which it is dealt with by the academic and bureaucratic world, about the nature of our own experiences and whether we feel ourselves responsible and blameworthy and the rest of it, which overlaps with the Western experience, but has a kind of a different dynamic to it in other traditions. That's why it interests me. If that's clear, I hope.
So we've been talking about disasters mostly as sort of a sudden big event that happens that requires a big response. But there are others that are more like a slow burn.
Right.
And I think nuclear waste would fit into
Yeah.
that classification. And you've done a fair bit of work on nuclear waste.
Right.
And I wonder if you'd like to comment, especially on the ethical aspects of how we deal with nuclear waste as sort of a slow burn disaster.
Right. I think make two comments. One of them is that if you take a look at the world around you, you'll see the results of a whole series of failed utopias. That is, if you look at in Toronto, the Highway 401, or almost a whole lot of things littering the landscape, these are dreams that people had that, we'd have like cars that would zip along rapidly and so on. So they built highways to do this stuff, or the buildings that people generated. A lot of them were created so that people were dreaming about what a better future might look like, and they came up with these things which litter the landscape, which are sort of not very imaginative. They're just locked into a way of thinking about the future. And nuclear power is a perfect example of that, where nuclear power was in the 50s when it was first touted as a way of, in a kind of a good way. It was because we had nuclear weapons and Canada decided it wasn't going to have nuclear weapons, and we had all kinds of nuclear expertise, that maybe we could have atoms for peace and that we would switch over to nuclear power. One can understand that in those days. And part of that was that, in fact, if you look at some of the work that was done in the 1950s and early 60s, there were going to be like 250 nuclear power stations across Canada. There was going to be a whole network. It was going to be, famous saying was, the electricity would be too cheap to measure and so on. And so it was a kind of utopia. And as with a lot of utopias, failed utopias, the problems were, as in fact, caused in part by the dreaming of this utopian vision. So throughout all this whole process, as the nuclear waste began to accumulate, and most nuclear power discussions were never about the nuclear waste. It was just assumed we'd figure out something to do with it, and people would dump it somewhere. And when I first got started in the early 1980s, people were talking about how, well, we just put it up in the north because nobody lives there. This is before people became interested in indigenous peoples and reservations and so on. That, oh, well, there's a lot of empty space up there, so we'll just put it somewhere. Or we'll come up with a grand solution. Since we've got this grand solution about nuclear power, we'll come up with a grand solution for how to, I don't know, do something with nuclear waste. We'll come up with some magical invisibility formula that will eliminate it. And we still have not done that. And nuclear waste is the Achilles heel for the nuclear power industry, because it keeps generating this waste, which is extremely difficult to manage, and is right now is still unable to find a lasting home for itself. And what I became interested in, particularly in terms of the ethics of it, was that, again, the start of it was kind of ethical. And the ways in which the nuclear engineers have always talked about it was, in terms of the waste part, was we have to deal with it now. We created it, and so maybe we have to solve this. And so the best way to solve it is to build a vast holding place for it underground somewhere, and we will come up with the great engineering solutions for it. And other people, NGOs and others, have found this to be a lousy solution. And their main concern is to stop nuclear power generating this waste. And the engineering solution has been, until at least very recently, was, we've got this waste, we're going to have to solve it. And so we'll come up with a grand solution. And the anti-nuclear people, of whom I'm a strong supporter, have basically said, until you stop producing nuclear waste, we shouldn't support nuclear power, and we shouldn't support it until you come up with a better way of handling it, if at all. And the nuclear industry has never agreed to this. They have created a variety of interim agencies and so on to deal with trying to get somebody who will finally take this material. Ethically, what's interesting is that because nuclear waste has this very long timeline, some of the discussions include a million-year forecast and thousands of years and all the rest of it. And as soon as you do that, ethics arrives. The question about what to do about future generations, what to do about whether or not the technologies that we are engaging in are really the kind of future we want to have, it suddenly arrives. That is, ethics is very strongly tied to the longer term. And the engineering solution, and I have many good friends who are engineers. I'm not talking about all engineers, but just sort of the engineering mentality of the people who support the nuclear industry has been, let us come up with a short-term, what they would call a pragmatic solution to this, and let the long-term deal with itself, really, I mean, over that long period of time. And the NGO model has been split. Part of it has been, let us think about the overall function of technology in our world. Did we make the right decisions, and what does it mean to have these kind of technologies in our world? And it got muddied by this question, this short-term question about terrorism, about whether or not the solution to the waste, if there is a solution to it, might be compromised by the arrival of dangers of terrorism, which again, people just didn't think about way back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So it's deeply saturated in ethics. And it's very interesting to be an anti-nuke, which I've been for a very long time. And it's very interesting to see the way in which the science and the engineering and all the rest of it is just saturated with ethical judgments and statements, in spite of the
So,
fact that it's a bunch of, nuclear plutonium and uranium and, physical stuff that you can actually, pick up in your hands.
so this is making me think about Beck's Risk Society.
Right. Totally.
And you talk about utopian visions, and there are a set of older utopian visions that are based upon communitarian values, how people relate to each other, how communities relate to each other.
Right.
Some of the more modern utopia visions you're talking about are based upon science creating the best of all possible worlds,
Yeah.
which is a very different approach.
Yes, I agree.
So if these, do you think utopian visions based upon science are essentially opening a Pandora's box then, and just accelerating this risk society and the kind of gap that people talk to about the rate at which we're creating risks as compared to the rate at which we can, manage or deal with them? That that sort of leads to a dystopian kind of future. So, are you taking that sort of pessimistic perspective on how Western technological society creates utopian visions, or do you perhaps have a more optimistic perspective?
I don't tend towards the optimistic perspective. I mean, the thing about science is that it has for 300 to 400 years been basically um, improving and wrecking previous worldviews. I mean, that's part of its fascination and its glory, which is that it takes absolutely nothing for granted in its own world, and so that's very important. But it makes it very difficult to use general ethical principles, communitarian, whatever they might be, that ran much more. I won't call them simpler, but much more um, societies that had ways of life that handled the risks in their ways of life in ways that we don't agree with, but the risks were woven into their social norms, and we just keep generating new risks that we then have to create new social norms for. And first of all, it's exhausting, and second of all, not everybody can do it. Not everybody. You only have to look at, we're in the middle of the COVID crisis, at just how few people really understand what it is that's happening. The fact that we have been able within a year and a half, thanks to some back history, to be able to come up with major vaccines for COVID is an astonishing scientific achievement. And yet, if you take a look around you, the amount of sheer ignorance about this among even reasonably educated citizenry is staggering. So we are enmeshed in this situation. Part of the solution, it's not a solution really, is to um, Well, many years ago, I was involved in looking at religious and sacred traditions, and I went to a conference in Chicago, Parliament of World Religions, and they had a sub-conference on societies that had been sustainable for over 1,000 years and maybe 2,000 years, and they had a whole series of anthropologists. And as is my wont, when they got to the question period about all these societies, I stood up and asked, I said, well, this has all been very interesting, but is there anything that all these societies had in common since they've been sustainable for long periods of time? And one of the eminent anthropologists stopped for about 30 seconds, and then he said, yeah, all of these societies had ancestor worship. And this uh, really, really important understanding is that we are just not using the past properly. We are just we whether it's ancestor worship or the understanding of the past, is something that we keep getting rid of. And one of my main environmental issues has always been, um, this is all very interesting about the future, but what about the dreams that the people in the past had about the future? What about all of the history of humankind and all the things that aspirations that people had that we are threatening with the carelessness with which we're messing with this planet? And I'm 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 more pessimistic. The less people think about um, their ancestors, and our ancestors, you and I are old enough to probably become ancestors if we're not careful much
In
longer,
the near future.
in the very near future. Um, that they have it. The society which we live in is, because of science and because of a lot of other things, tends towards the rootless. It just does. It's just the migration of peoples and all the rest of it. So any roots that we can find, and obviously as an environmentalist, I think our natural roots are absolutely the most important, but our historic roots and the way in which we think is so important, and to be dumping it all the time is what makes me pessimistic. I'm much more, so I guess I'm pessimistic about the past in some sense. I'm just like, I mean, it's just we just treat the past so poorly.
We
Um,
do.
and
Uh,
I find that to be not just tragic, but it's actually giving us less resources to handle the situation we're in part because history is so saturated with problems. That is, it's not an easy legacy. We only have to look at some of the things that are going on around us. That it's not an easy legacy, but that work is necessary. It's just hard to think about it in terms of how useful it would be for contemporary situations, because our contemporary situations are, in their own way, so full of the new things that we have to learn. So it's a very complicated dance.
you made one comment earlier where you said science takes nothing for granted. Um, but
In its own,
does it take
in,
itself for granted
the second part of that clause was in its own world.
in its own world? Okay.
And it does all kinds of things that are problematic, in its own way.
Of course,
Uh,
that isn't science. That's the culture of scientists and people who believe in science.
yeah, it's also science. Science works very well in a particular set of constraints and how it handles evidence, which is not everything. Sometimes it looks like it's everything, but it's not everything. Right? It's the difference between thinking about love and thinking about the chemistry of love, right? Different things, right?
So we could talk about all these things forever. But before I end our conversation,
Right.
if you were in my place interviewing Professor Peter Timmerman,
Right.
what question would you ask him?
What question would I ask him? Hmm, that's a good question. I think, as you know, I think I hate to say this, but I think a lot of disaster research is very narrow. And what I like about working with you and working with some other people is to break it open there's so much, it's so interesting and it's so central to the human experience. And it engages with things that um, just the way in which the culture and the academic culture and the rest of it works are underplayed, but they're absolutely crucial. And I think I'm thinking particularly of things like fantasy and imagination, love, a range of this. Just one of the reasons why, as an environmentalist and as somebody who's interested in different kinds of thought, I find that to be more interesting than the absolutely necessary how do we manage this disaster effectively and efficiently to save lives. And that's a driven principle and a good principle of disaster and emergency management. But I think part of our role is to break that open and say yes, and what maybe not, it would make it more effective if it was wider and deeper in its own conceptual understanding. That
And
was
that would be a great topic for your
that was
next.
my way of avoiding what I asked myself. So anyway,
So maybe your next paper in the Zen of disasters will address that.
we'll do our best. With your
Well,
help, we'll do our best.
Peter, I'd like to thank you so much for the fascinating interview, and I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks to everybody.